So, okay, our Shiny app is only going to be useful if it can take in input values, do some R calculations, and then spit out the result of those calculations or results. And so the first thing we need to be able to do is actually take in some input values. And so this next code demonstration, all we're going to do is create a slider which has to occur in the user interface, and then the values for those sliders that the user selects is going to be passed into the server function, which is then just going to send it back as is to the user interface function to redisplay it. Okay, so this is just another building exercise. We're not going to do anything with the input other than spit it right back out at the user interface to display it as is. So let's try. Okay, now let's see if we can get our Shiny app to actually take in values from the user via a slider, put them to the server, and then the server will return the values. Okay, so I have my UI.R Shiny UI function here, and in my sidebar layout, on the sidebar part, on the sidebar panel, I'm going to have a slider. So I'm going to give a user a prompt that says move the slider, and then slider input, this function right here is going to create the slider and display it. And then I'm going to name, I have it named slider 2. Okay, so I've named the slider 2, and then the command says slide me. Okay, it's going to go from 0 to 100, and it's going to have the starting value at 0. Okay, now let's talk about the main panel in a second. Okay, so I take that slider value, I input it, it's given a value called slider 2, the input from the slider displayed to the user. Okay, now my Shiny server is a function that takes as its argument a function that takes input and output. Okay, then you have to have these curly braces because you need to have a function. It's defining a function, so a function has to have the curly braces, and then down here you have to remember to close both the curly braces and the Shiny server parentheses. Okay, and then what it's going to do is it's going to take the input. Okay, input is what's input from the UI.R Shiny UI function, and it says take an input. Oh, and let's get rid of that real quick just so it's consistent with what's in the R Markdown code from the slides. And it's going to say take in slider 2, and then what I want to do is just render it. In other words, display the text, and I'm going to name that output text1. Okay, so then when we go back to UI.R in the main panel, it says here's the slider value, and text output is text1. So that same text that we labeled from the output from the server function is going to get displayed in the main panel. So let's run it and just see how it looks. Okay, so here it's the move the slider part. Here's the slider. As I move it, the slider value is displayed over here. So what's happening, right, is the slider is receiving a value from the user. That value is given the label slider 2. Okay, in the server.r function, it's grabbing that from the slot input $slider 2. Okay, and then it's spitting it back out as output $text1, and then the UI.R is displaying it. Now, there's nothing in particular, I want to emphasize, there's nothing in particular about having the slider in the sidebar panel and the text in the main panel, and that there's nothing in particular about this order. It's not sort of running the slider and then displaying it because this R code happens to occur later on in the text than this R code, right? We could have had the slider output in the main panel and the slider in the main panel and the output in the sidebar. So that's an important thing to think about with Shiny and reactive expressions. It's not kind of, you don't want to think about it running linearly like a regular R program. Of course, at some level it is because it is an R program, but the way in which the server is going, it's sort of running reactively and kind of constantly going back and forth. Okay? So you just want to kind of change your mindset about that a little bit than how it is in normal R programming. Okay? And now notice another thing is if I were to label this text, output $text, and rerun it, okay, it doesn't display anything because the label text doesn't mean anything to UI.R. It's thinking it's text1 when it says text output. Okay? So let's reload it, and then now it'll work. See, it's displaying it again. Same thing with the slider. If I were to call this slider instead of slider 2, or call it slider 1, okay, it doesn't display anything because there is no, it doesn't display anything because the render text from the UI or the server function is looking for slider 2, and the UI has never put out anything called slider 2, anything labeled slider 2. Okay, so if I were to change this to slider 1, reload it, it now works. Okay, so remember that your labels have to match up. The last thing I'll do is just give you a sense of how you can start to use these things for manipulation. Let's just add 10 to the input of this, to the slider input, and then show how we can now display. Okay, it's not doing much, right? 29 adds 10 and gives you 39, but you can see actually now what we've done is we've taken a value from the user, used R to manipulate that input value, in this case a very simple manipulation, added 10, and then sent that back to the user interface to be displayed. Okay, and all of these things are happening reactively. Okay, so try this out, create a slider or a check down box or a button or something like that that gets an input and displays it back out, and just so then we'll move on to the next step of actually trying to create like a prediction algorithm, or we'll start to create where we actually manipulate these numbers in the server.r function.